In this series, we'll be going over all the cards banned in the commons only format, Pauper, and discussing why they're banned and if they could be unbanned today. This video will go over the cards that were banned when Pauper became an official sanctioned format, as well as more cards that were banned within a year of their introduction to the format. Pauper became sanctioned in 2019, and with it retooled how legality worked in the format to a degree. Up until then, Pauper was only recognized as a format in MTGO, with Paper Pauper existing as a casual, unsanctioned format. As such, the card legality in Pauper was determined by what cards were printed as a common in MTGO. While this mostly mirrored the paper card pool's commons, there were some notable exceptions. With the introduction of Pauper as a sanctioned format, they opted to make any common eligible for Pauper legality regardless of where it was printed as common. With this, however, Wizards banned 3 cards that had not been legal online but were commons in old paper printings. The first of these cards was Sinkhole, a sorcerer that costs 2 black mana and destroys target land and was banned in June of 2019. So why was Sinkhole banned? Land destruction is an effect that Magic tends to shy away from in modern card design, with most land destruction in the modern day specifically punishing non-basics or having high mana values. This alone would have made Wizards hesitant to introduce Sinkhole to the format, but what really pushed Sinkhole over the edge was that Pauper already had a playable mono-black land destruction deck. Sinkhole's mana value of 2 beat every other land destruction spell in the format in terms of efficiency. Decks already ran cards like Rancid Earth at 4 copies in decks. The addition of Sinkhole would allow these decks to shave down their mana curves and more consistently overwhelm your opponent in the early game. Mono-black land destruction decks are somewhat lacking in playable 2-drops, relying on the generically good black draw spells to fill spaces in the decks. Even with these, the deck often lacks impactful turn 2 plays, with Lurking Informant or similar creatures often filling spots. The addition of Sinkhole would allow these decks to focus on their primary game plan lower on the curve and shave the higher mana value land destruction spells altogether. Wizards worried about pushing the power level of an already somewhat infamous archetype into the format and opted to pre-ban Sinkhole before it could enter sanctioned Pauper. Wizards does not ban cards exclusively for power level concerns, and has in the past banned cards that encourage play patterns deemed as unhealthy for the meta or especially unfun to play against. While land destruction has its fans, a majority of the player base and designers alike do not enjoy the play pattern or find them healthy for good Magic. As such, it's not surprising to see why they banned the card, especially since its only reprint in recent times had printed the card as a rare. Sinkhole was only ever printed as a common back in the days of Alpha before balancing for limited, let alone Pauper, was even a consideration. Beyond its unfun nature in the format, it would only be legal via technicality and did not fit with the general spirit of common cards by modern standards. Could Sinkhole be unbanned? No. While giving these decks Sinkhole might not break the game, it would not do any good for the health of the format, and as such, Sinkhole is likely to stay in the ban list. It would only help a deck that already is fine without it and make for more games where one player doesn't get to play Magic. Given that Wizards of the Coast has an aversion to non-conditional land destruction in general, it's hard to believe they'd ever want to unban Sinkhole, even if they felt like it was perfectly balanced for the format. In fact, Sinkhole is mana efficient enough that decks not even built around land destruction might pick up the card, at least for sideboards. The biggest point against Sinkhole is that Affinity runs a high number of indestructible lands, but one bad matchup in the format full of decks trying to make the most out of their mana is not enough to say the card is reasonable. As of now, land destruction sits on the fringes of the format, which is arguably where Wizards wants it, if they want it in the format at all. The addition of Sinkhole would only push a playstyle Wizards wants to avoid to further prominence, especially with the hype of an unbanning, and thus it will likely remain on the ban list forever. How could Sinkhole be fixed to be unbanned? The most simple way of fixing Sinkhole would be to simply increase its mana value by 1, putting it on the same rate with Stone Rain, which is the mana value Wizards feels comfortable printing targeted land destruction at without drawbacks. This would notably make the card one of the weaker options for mono-black land destruction, since Icequake and other 3-mana land destruction spells often even have upsides. Its mana value really is the only thing overtly pushing Sinkhole into the category of being too good. If it costs any more than 2, Sinkhole would likely have never been looked at for a ban during the unification. While that may seem like an overly minor thing to hinge an entire ban on, land destruction is innately more impactful the sooner you can cast it. The longer you wait to cast land destruction spells, the more likely your opponent will have drawn lands to replace it. Sinkhole can hit early and set your opponent back before they've even cast a spell, and allows you to run away with the game from there. At 3 mana, it's just enough in the list of land destruction spells that even just a turn later feels so much worse to cast. Your opponent has had a whole extra turn to potentially develop a threat, not to mention if they spend their turns developing their mana and offset your land destruction outright. While a small change at the surface, adding 1 generic mana to the cost of Sinkhole really would make all the difference. The second card banned upon the unification of Pauper was Hymn to Tourach. This sorcery costs 2 black mana, it makes target player discard 2 cards at random, and was banned in June of 2019. Why was Hymn to Tourach banned? Most formats have access to targeted discard spells which allow you to rip away the most dangerous cards from your opponent. These discard spells are often printed in uncommon or higher, leaving black Pauper decks to mostly rely on spells that your opponent choose what card they discard. Hymn to Tourach exists in a middle ground where you might discard nothing of impact, or you might completely ruin your opponent's hand. Even the strongest discard spells like Thoughtseize tend to limit you from taking lands. Meanwhile, Hymn to Tourach, with a bit of luck, can sometimes discard both of the lands into your opponent's hand, and leave them completely unable to play. Wrench Mind is already legal in Pauper, and is a similar 2-for-1 discard most of the time at the same mana value. It does see some play in mono-black decks of the format, yet the choices it gives your opponent holds it back from being half as oppressive as Hymn to Tourach would be. Not only does your opponent get to decide what 2 cards to discard to Wrench Mind, if they have an artifact to discard, they don't even have to discard a second card. In comparison, Hymn to Tourach will rip apart your opponent's hand regardless of what either player would want. Blue decks will be forced to burn their counter magic on Hymn to Tourach out of fear of losing 2 more powerful spells, while against the format's more typical discard options, they'd usually be free to discard the least important card in their hand. Most discard spells with low mana values go neutral in card advantage, yet Hymn to Tourach will put your opponent behind on cards every time it resolves, even if it doesn't necessarily hit the most important cards in the hand. And when it does snipe their best cards, sometimes it wins you the game on the spot. Hymn to Tourach is especially backbreaking against an opponent who has mulliganed down to less cards in their hand, with a 5 or less card starting essentially being a death sentence if your opponent has Hymn to Tourach in hand. Could Hymn to Tourach be unbanned? No. It's another case where the card is not the most broken card on the ban list and might not outright warp the meta. However, the random nature of the discard adds a level of unwelcome variance and outright non-games that Wizards tends to frown upon. It's hard to argue that the ability to use Dark Ritual to cast Hymn to Tourach on the first turn alongside 1-mana discard spells like Raven's Crime is something that would be healthy for the format. As such, it was a reasonable ban at the time of its introduction to the format, and remains that way to this day. Black decks already have the ability to interact without paying mana thanks to spells like Snuff Out. Black control decks do not need the added disruption that Hymn to Tourach spreads throughout the game to be viable, and will just likely muscle out other decks if the card were ever unbanned. In general, random discard is avoided these days for the most part, especially at mana values this low. While land destruction exists on the fringes of playability, but not necessarily meta, discard has always been a part of mono-black control's toolkit in Pauper. As such, Hymn to Tourach would be more than an issue of simply being a card that supports unhealthy play patterns and designs. It would be a mana-efficient one that was likely to see actual competitive play. How could Hymn to Tourach be fixed? While the most straightforward solution would be to make you discard your opponent's choice instead of random, one could argue allowing Pauper both Wretched Mind and even this nerfed 2-mana Hymn to Tourach might be too powerful. Raising its mana value would keep the unique nature of discarding 2 cards at random, but make it more reasonable. A mana value of 4 would prevent someone from Dark Ritualing it on turn 1, but it might also prevent the card from ever seeing play. The best option then would likely be to meet in the middle, with the first discard being random and the second being of your opponent's choice. This would still make it better than Wrench Mind, maintaining some of its original mechanical identity, and reduce the blow-up potential of the card. It's by no means perfect, and some may argue it may still need a mana value increase to be a healthy power level card for Pauper even with this, but it is certainly more reasonable than the card as it currently exists. The final of the 3 cards banned upon unification was High Tide. This instant costs 1 blue mana and makes it so until the end of turn, whenever a player taps an island for mana, that player adds an additional blue mana. It was banned in June of 2019. So why was High Tide banned? Well, High Tide has a lot of room for combo potential, with legacy decks using Candelabra of Tuanos to one-tap lands and generate enough mana to start a proper combo turn. Pauper is no stranger to combo decks built off of generating a lot of mana, but there was concern that High Tide provided too much too easily. While many of High Tide's best combo pieces are not legal, Ghostly Flicker was already a staple of the format given the value and combo potential it had. High Tide decks in particular would be able to not only untap their islands to generate more mana, but could also flicker an Archaeomancer to put High Tide back in hand and cast it again. Since High Tide's stacked, flickering in this way would allow your islands to go positive when casting spells far easier and carry you through the combo turn. Hypothetical Pauper High Tide lists brewed for paper Pauper before unification often won off of the back of Sage Road Denizen. This 3-mana Vidalcan Wizard would mill your opponent for 2 cards whenever a blue creature entered the battlefield. With enough mana from High Tide, it would be fairly trivial to loop your flicker spells and creatures that added them back to hand, and eventually mill your opponent out. While Pauper does not have access to many tutors, it does notably have Merchant Scroll. Merchant Scroll searches instants and adds it to hand, meaning that High Tide decks would have virtually had 8 copies of the card to work with, as well as ways to search up Ghostly Flicker. Now, could High Tide be unbanned? This one is a maybe. Of the cards banned with the format sanctioning, High Tide is one that is most easily argued for an unbanning. While you could set up impressive combo turns that win the game on the spot, in practice, these High Tide combos are slow or clunky. They needed time or luck to set up or draw into the proper pieces. It doesn't help that High Tide is generally a flimsy strategy, with a deck that doesn't even really do much usually if not allowed to resolve its namesake card. This is Pauper, however, so a deck being somewhat slow isn't necessarily a death sentence. With proper building to counteract the aggro of the format, High Tide would likely be playable, but there are strong control decks in the format with access to powerful answers. It might even be outpaced by more aggressive tuned combo decks. That said, given the format's history with decks that cheat on mana to combo off on, or blaze ahead of your opponent, it's understandable why they chose not to allow High Tide into the format, and have kept it banned to this day. The rest of the cards added to the format after unification either slotted into decks or faded into the background, with no bans coming in the immediate months after Pauper's rise to being sanctioned. As for High Tide itself, it has remained on the ban list since, with some insistent that its addition to the format would introduce an interesting new deck to the meta. Others are less convinced, especially given that High Tide decks are an archetype robust enough for Legacy when given enough appropriate cards to build around. So how could High Tide be fixed? Given its borderline status in terms of balance, it wouldn't take too much to rein in High Tide. For one, simply making it a sorcery would turn off the ability to search it with a card like Mystical Teachings, as well as limit the timings in which someone could go for a big High Tide play. A more drastic measure to balance the card would be giving it a once per turn restriction, making it so you cannot make your islands tap for anything more than one additional blue mana. This would greatly dampen the card's combo potential, limiting you to only the most efficient ways to take advantage of High Tide, such as with Candelabra of Tauros, which is not Pauper legal. This weaker version may even still see some play as a more conventional mana acceleration tool and not as a combo piece, although it's hard to say for certain if being a glorified ritual only would be worth it. Some can and will argue that High Tide could re-enter the format as is with little to no changes and be perfectly fine, especially since the deck would often fold to a well-timed duress anyway. Considering that it never saw sanctioned play in Pauper, we may never fully know if it would be healthy for the format as it currently exists. It wouldn't be long after unification until Pauper saw its next shakeup with the rise of Modern Horizons. A few months after Pauper became official, the format was introduced to Arcum's Astrolabe. It costs 1 generic snow mana, which can be paid with 1 mana from any permanent with the snow type, and is a snow artifact itself. When Arcum's Astrolabe enters the battlefield, you draw a card. You can pay 1 generic mana and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. The artifact was banned in October of 2019. Now, why was Arcum's Astrolabe banned? This card became infamous quickly in multiple formats for how much it trivialized mana bases. Its mana efficiency made it a cantrip that replaced itself, and from there could filter your mana into any color. Snow basically provided mana flexibility that usually only came from rare dual lands. This advantage was notable in Modern and Legacy, and thus was even more polarizing in a format like Pauper, which had been up to that point defined by an inability for greedy mana bases to get ahead. Multicolored decks needed to rely on slower tap lands usually, whereas Astrolabe allowed you to play with basics and still cast spells in upwards of 3 or 4 colors. Scred became one of the premier removal spells in the format now that snow permanents were so rewarding to run. The outcry for a banning for the card was so immense that when it wasn't included in the regularly scheduled ban list update for all formats, Wizards banned it in an unplanned second ban announcement 2 weeks later. So, could Arcum's Astrolabe be unbanned? The answer to that question is probably no. Arcum's Astrolabe offers a level of consistency the format just does not want or need. Multicolor decks are not struggling in the format and have plenty of tools that make them reasonable without pushing half as far as Astrolabe does. Ash Barrens and other land cycling cards provide quality options for multicolor decks, but still limit them to playing slower as a result. In comparison, Arcum's Astrolabe actively rewards the player for wanting to play it by replacing itself and makes for quicker, more flexible multicolor mana bases on top of that. One of the key weaknesses of playing a deck that's 3 or more colors is supposed to be less consistency and ability to cast your spells. Something Arcum's Astrolabe lets you circumvent in a way that uses basic lands enough that it lets these greedy mana bases dodge conventional anti-non-basic hate cards. Instead of helping cover for a weakness, Arcum's Astrolabe outright got rid of it. It's currently banned in Legacy and Modern for similar reasons, and thus it's unlikely to ever come off the list in the much lower power format of Pauper. It not only built a whole archetype around itself, it being a 1-mana artifact that drew a card on entering the battlefield also makes it a viable option for Coldrith Rebirth style decks as well as various other artifact-based strategies like the Affinity. How could Arcum's Astrolabe be fixed to be unbanned? The most practical way of fixing Arcum's Astrolabe would be at a minimum to double its mana value. At just 1 mana, Arcum's Astrolabe fixes your mana as early as turn 2 in most games. You were free to flex into whatever 2-drop you wanted to cast and would generally be able to play it no matter what colors you needed access to. And from there, you'd be on solid footing throughout the rest of the game. By removing the ability to cast Astrolabe so early, you'd curb just how easily snow decks accessed all their colors. Another option would be to make it so that the mana Arcum's Astrolabe produces can only be used to cast snow spells or for the abilities of snow permanents. This would allow the card to remain powerful, but now only function to benefit dedicated snow decks. As the card currently exists, it just made decks pivot their mana base's interaction towards a snow focus, since snow mana was so easily accessible instead of actually building a snow deck. The next card to warp Pauper to a game-breaking degree upon arrival, and the last one we'll talk about today, was the Throne of Eldrain's Mystic Sanctuary. This land taps for 1 blue mana and enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 3 or more islands. When Mystic Sanctuary enters the battlefield untapped, you may put target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. This card was banned from Pauper in July of 2020. Now, why was Mystic Sanctuary banned? Well, worse than an island if used as one of your first land drops, in the mid to late game, Mystic Sanctuary offers value at worst and the potential to overtake a game at best. A common play pattern for Mystic Sanctuary was to use it to set up loops where you'd always be able to redraw into the same counterspell, and thus always have an answer for whatever your opponent happened to top deck. The most common way of doing this would be via using Deprive, a 2-mana counterspell with additional cost of bouncing a land you control back to hand. This downside is actually an upside with Mystic Sanctuary, allowing you to reuse enter the battlefield triggers and put Deprive back on top. Other than Deprive, Tragic Lesson provided a way to both draw the card stacked on top and bounce the Mystic Sanctuary back to hand at once. Modern banned Mystic Sanctuary for similar reasons, and Pauper's access to extremely powerful common spells made it arguably just as powerful there as it was in Modern. As such, the card was banned less than a year later. Now, could Mystic Sanctuary be unbanned? The answer to this question is probably no. Any deck that ran blue could reasonably find reason to slot in 2 copies of Mystic Sanctuary and use them to extend their grind game far further than it would have gone otherwise. Mystic Sanctuary is a card that would only limit the ability for more powerful common instants and sorceries to be printed into the format. Unbanning it would just push Dimir Terror decks far to ahead of the pack, as well as bolstering just about every other blue strategy in the process. Looping Mystic Sanctuary is too much of a problem to realistically not address, and it is more practical to leave Mystic Sanctuary banned than ban Deprive and every other card that can loop the land. How could Mystic Sanctuary be fixed to be unbanned? Mystic Sanctuary has the complexity and power of a rare squeezed into a common. To rectify that, it would be better if Mystic Sanctuary shuffled the instant to sorcery back into your deck instead of putting it on top. This would still likely be a decently playable card, especially with Merchant Scroll in the format to help find the card that got shuffled back in. The card would be nowhere near as ubiquitous and not truly loopable, but those are all changes that would likely bring the card down to the general power level of Pauper's card pool. Other than that, there aren't many other changes that could help make it reasonable that don't strip the card of its identity. Alright, and that's the video. The next video will go over cards that had time to become established as part of Pauper's metagame before eventually getting banned, as well as type mechanics that have proven to be problematic for Pauper multiple times. And as always, if you have any ideas for future videos for this channel, please let us know down in the comments below.